Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, September 28th, day 723 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob, and Shavua Tov, a good week to you. At least here in Israel, we start our week today.
Yeah, Shavua Tov.
It is so great to see you, and you had quite the busy week last week. And in addition to exclusively revealing details from U.S. President Donald Trump's 21-point plan on our site yesterday, you were in New York all last week to cover the United Nations General Assembly. So we're going to hear about the plan and highlights of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, the general going-ons in New York, and we'll hear how Trump is vowing that intensive talks will continue until the Gaza war is ended and all Israeli hostages are back home. So we'll speak about all this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Jacob, we have so much to cover, but I'd like to start with Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly. And first of all, just tell us about the mood there in terms of Israel and the Gaza war. And the war is continuing, obviously, and some 800,000 Gazans have so far left Gaza City. So how would you compare the scene this year to years past? And obviously, you have to talk about the props that Bibi brought this year.
Of course. And we talked about this a little bit before we got on, so I was thinking about what it was like last year. And I do remember the crowd being pretty empty during Netanyahu's speech, but this concept of a mass walkout, which is what we saw on Friday, organized by the Palestinian mission to the UN and seeing, I think, representatives from dozens of countries. I think I might have even counted over 100, maybe 200 members who walked out, and something that they came in for the first speech, which was Netanyahu, in order simply to walk out. Last year, I don't think they did that, if I can recall correctly, but I think it demonstrates the real unprecedented nature of Israel's isolation right now at the UN and more broadly in the international community. The other thing I remember about last year's speech, which was also, I think I looked back at my readout and it was basically a blistering speech pushing back on the international community. So I think there's a theme that's often in all Netanyahu's speeches at the UN, because it's a pretty hostile place to be an Israeli representative, definitely after 2 years of war. But if you recall, what happened last year is moments after Netanyahu finished his address, he was actually meeting with us, holding a briefing, or I guess a senior Israeli official was holding a briefing. And that was when explosions went off in Beirut that killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. So that was a pretty momentous day. That it came after the pager operation, but it was really that. So we were already in the beginning of the end of the Hezbollah rule, or the reign, at least to the extent as it was. But I think that was another turning point in the war that was coinciding with the speech at the UN. So that's what I was thinking in terms of the differences between then and now.
And in fact, of course, Netanyahu did refer to all the different changes that have happened throughout this past year of war. Obviously, the pager operation was in that, but it's not just that. We have Iran, the 12-day Iran war, and we have the Houthis. We have all sorts of different achievements. And of course, we cannot overlook the fact that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was still alive in Gaza, commanding Hamas fighters against Israel just a year ago. So there's a lot that has changed. Tell us a little bit more about the highlights from Netanyahu's speech.
Yeah, so I think definitely the noteworthy part at the beginning was this walkout, and you had an effort by the Israeli delegation to start standing and applauding. I think Netanyahu made sure that there were a couple hundred people in the audience that maybe I think were trying to take attention away from the walkout. So it was a really loud applause in Netanyahu starts, but the gimmicks, you knew about them even before, because there started being reports about these massive loudspeakers that the IDF had set up. First, Netanyahu's office said on the Gaza border. Then the IDF admitted actually they're already inside Gaza. There was even reporting that revealed that the loudspeakers that were used in order to broadcast Netanyahu's speech, which is why he had them moved into Gaza, were were being used at IDF bases if there are Tzava Adom, if there's like rocket sirens. So had there been something that happened during that time, we would have been out of those speakers in order to alert soldiers. Luckily, nothing happened, but I think that was one of the many criticisms Netanyahu faced as a result of this, I guess you could say, stunt. His argument was he wanted to be able to reach the hostages, to also possibly reach Gazans as well. They were sent text messages, which is something that Netanyahu talked about during the speech, that we had taken over the communications of Gaza and they're getting the message. We're trying to reach them directly, so that going over the heads of Hamas. So that was another stunt. There was Netanyahu came to the hall holding or wearing a big QR code on his lapel of his suit. And he encouraged listeners, viewers to scan the code, and they could then see footage from Hamas's October 7th onslaught to demonstrate why Israel is carrying out this fight. So those were, I think, several of the main gimmicks that came to mind. He even did this pop quiz where he took out a poster and asked the audience a multiple choice question about how which countries or which of these options say death to America, death to Israel, and obviously the answer ended up being all of the above, to try to present this argument that Israel and the U.S. are in a united front against the forces of evil. Those kinds of gimmicks, I think, which have become somewhat traditional for Netanyahu's speeches at the UN. There was maps that he pulled out as well, but I think this one was even more chock full of them. It's just a further highlighting that the speech is more for a domestic audience. I think, I mean, the audience in the UN wasn't really there. The speech is pretty, the chamber was empty. But Netanyahu, I think, is trying to reach those back home and show that he's, despite the hostile atmosphere, he's able to present a case for Israel that I think many Israelis, even though if they don't agree with him personally, are willing to agree with some of the arguments he's making in defense of the war and calling out the hypocrisy of countries that are recognizing a Palestinian state right now.
Right. That was definitely a main leitmotif of his speech as well. The idea that a slew of countries just last week recognized a Palestinian state. So there's something like 145 UN nations that now recognize the state of Palestine. And one of the quotes that he said is just obviously a jewel. And he says, giving the Palestinians a state 1 mile from Jerusalem after October 7th is like giving Al Qaeda a state 1 mile from New York City after September 11th. This is sheer madness. It's insane, and we won't do it. That obviously is speaking more to the American audience, putting it in the rubric of September 11th, which was just marked, obviously, a bit earlier in the month. And were there other comments along this vein in terms of the Palestinian state?
I mean, I think you hit the main one right there in terms of trying to put it to an American audience. I think what maybe some listeners might have been looking for was some sort of comments talking about what President Trump has been referring to in the recent days, which is his plan to end the war. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was probably unlikely he's going to wait until he meets with President Trump on Monday at the White House to discuss this in person. But there was an opportunity for Netanyahu to say pretty openly that he's willing to embrace this proposal, even if he has to say yes, but he chose not to do that and basically hammered down the same points about Israel's conditions for ending the war that are unlikely to jive with this Trump proposal, which we can get into in a little bit. And I think that is something to take note, that he didn't take this opportunity to present his vision for the day after or get into the next steps. He did notably talk a little bit about expanding the Abraham Accords and looking at Syria and Lebanon and viewing them as two countries that actually we could have peace with them in the actually foreseeable future, which is notable that he took up time in this speech to do that. I think he may be moving away from Saudi Arabia, which had been the country that he had been talking about in previous UN speeches. I think a little bit of a recognition that that's going to take more time. But I think what I spoke with an Arab diplomat from one of those countries afterwards who said that, look, it's that we appreciate these overtures, but it's also we want to see actions on the ground. And right now, there's Israeli strikes in those countries at an almost daily basis. Obviously, Israel argues that it's in order to protect its own security interests, that Hezbollah is violating the ceasefire. But what even the U.S. is arguing is that some of these strikes are harming efforts to try to rebuild these countries because they delegitimize the government. That they themselves, those leaders, be it Aoun in Lebanon or Shara in Syria, are committed currently to trying to ensure that there's no Iranian influence there. And if we undermine them too much with these strikes, we're risking bringing another leader that actually will be closer to Iran.
Okay, we are going to go to a short break and then discuss in detail the 21-point plan. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. So, Jacob, you got your hands on a developing draft of the 21-point plan, and you made sure it was verified by two sources in the know. And essentially, the U.S. proposal for ending the war in Gaza encourages the Palestinians to remain in the Strip and provides for the creation of a pathway to a future Palestinian state. This is a big departure from previous Trump plans. And the document was shared with a handful of Arab and Muslim countries earlier last week, but it also contains clauses that have been staples in other proposals crafted by different stakeholders in recent months. So it just kind of shows it takes a village in a way. And it is this kind of quilt of all sorts of different plans together. But before we go through point by point, what jumped out at you? Was it the idea that it provides a horizon for the Palestinians, essentially?
Yes, those two things that you mentioned at the top is what I chose to highlight in the lead of this story. I think it's worth reading every single one of these 21 points. It's not too long, it's only a couple pages.
And we're going to go over it.
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah.
But I thought those were what really stuck out on the encouraging Gazans to stay, just because specifically the use of the word encouraging. Because if you think about what's happening in Israel, there's this concept of idud hagira miratzon, which is the encouraging of the voluntary migration of Gazans, which is what Ben Gvir and Smotrich and even people to the center, like Benny Gantz at times, has also supported this concept. And Netanyahu is definitely, at times, he's even made it the condition for ending the war when he adds and subtracts different conditions at times. But to have specifically encouraging people to stay, which is just a total rejection of that concept of encouraging people to leave if they want to, I thought was pretty stark. And I think it demonstrates that the Trump administration has heard the concerns of the Arab countries, that it is going to need their help in order to get Gaza up and running again. And I think that was a clear condition from them in order to have any sort of role in this process. They were not going to be part of a plan that basically would allow Israel to take over Gaza or build settlements there or just basically clear it of its civilians. So that was something that definitely jumped out at me. And the other thing that you mentioned as well is this concept of actually creating a pathway to a future Palestinian state. Because if you look at some of the briefings that have been happening in the White House and the State Department over the past 8 or 9 months since Trump took office, they can't even say whether or not they support a two-state solution. And I think part of that has to do with the concept is very, as you know, in Israel, not so popular. And I think they recognize just avoiding the term as a term is something that's a choice that they've made. But this is effectively doing the same thing. If you're talking about creating a Palestinian state, they're obviously not envisioning it in place of Israel. So it will be a two-state solution. So they're avoiding the rhetoric that they recognize is a little bit touchy in Israel, but they're also trying to give the Palestinians a political horizon, which is another concept that comes up in this plan. To be clear, though, this is not something that is going to happen tomorrow, and they're even vague regarding when this pathway can be created. It basically, the conditions are the development of Gaza, redevelopment of Gaza has been advanced, and the completion of a reform package for the Palestinian Authority. What exactly that reform package is, this plan, like a lot of things, it doesn't get too into details. I think there's this effort to try to use a lot of creative ambiguity to get both sides on board. But I think that actually could be a liability when you get to the nitty-gritty end of the negotiations, because A, it's going to require much more. When Trump talks about we're days away, or Wickoff says days away, I don't see how that is with this plan. I understand that it's been a little bit developed, a little bit since. There's some editing that's been done, but I think there's going to be a lot of work to after, even if both sides accept this, which is I think is going to be a huge leap. But those were the things that I think stood out to me, that at least it gives the possibility for an eventual Palestinian state. God knows how far it went off, but at some point.
Exactly. The whens and wherefores of the Palestinian state in the future just really reminds me of Cinderella. Yes, Cinderella, you can go to the ball if you get all your work done and you find something appropriate to wear. It just seems a bit far-fetched, but it's still there, which is really important. And when I was reading your 21 points that you charted out in this article that you wrote, it really feels very fair-handed in a way, just the way they're even presented, meaning one for the Israelis, one for the Palestinians, one for the Israelis, one for the Palestinians. I'm going to zip through a couple of them and then stop me if you want to talk about something in more depth. So, number one, Gaza will be de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. Definitely one for the Israelis. Number two, Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of its people. Clearly, if Israel and Hamas agree to the proposal, the war will immediately end, with the idea of halting all operations and gradually withdrawing from the Strip. Within 48 hours of Israel publicly accepting the deal, all living and deceased hostages will be returned. Once the hostages are returned, Israel will free several hundred Palestinian security prisoners serving life sentences and over 1,000 Gazans arrested since the start of the war, along with the bodies of several hundred Palestinians. Once the hostages are returned, Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence will be granted amnesty, while members who wish to leave the Strip will be granted safe passage to receiving countries. I want to pause here, Jacob, because this idea of receiving countries, we obviously saw something really amazing with the speech from the head of Indonesia. And do you think that that would be one of the receiving countries, for example?
It makes sense. I think the countries that have been considered before have been Muslim countries. I think I've also heard Algeria in the past, Turkey. The tricky part is that you end up with a similar scenario with what you have with Qatar, which is that you ask these countries to host Hamas leaders. And in this case, I guess the assumption is that these will be peaceful, coexisting Hamas leaders who are leaving the Strip, who are gaining amnesty. But if they don't, then we're going to be upset at the countries that we asked to host them. So there's going to be a difficult, I don't know, call it a game that's going to have to be played, or an agreements that will have to be reached to maybe clarify the terms so we don't have a repeat of the situation with Qatar. But again, if you're asking countries to play this role, you can't get mad at them, or what they're arguing right now is you can't strike them afterwards for doing what you've asked.
Okay, number seven, once this agreement is reached, aid will surge into the Strip at rates no lower than the benchmark set in the January 2025 deal, which included 600 trucks of aid per day. Right now, I think we're at, what, 100, 150, 200, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah.
Number eight, aid will be distributed without interference from either side by the United Nations and the Red Crescent, along with other international organizations not associated with either Israel or Hamas. So who does this leave the door open for, Jacob?
Yeah, I think, and I mentioned this in the piece, it probably leaves the door open to the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, because this is technically an American organization. There's a lot of Israeli fingerprints on its creation, and it's got a lot of links to the actual government and to Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and his circle. But technically, maybe there's a window in that language. But it's possible, maybe, that this was actually crafted in a way to prevent the continued operation of GHF, and this is the way that Witkoff wanted to go about doing that. I think it'll be part of the subsequent negotiations that will still have to be held.
Okay, number nine is also a bit weird to me, at least, and it really reminds me of proposals that came out of Egypt, I think, about a year ago. And it's Gaza will be governed by a temporary transitional government of Palestinian technocrats who will be responsible for providing day-to-day services for the people of the Strip. The committee will be supervised by a new international body established by the US in consultation with Arab and European partners. So, what do you make of this, Jacob?
I think that's where they took the Blair plan that we talked about and revealed a couple weeks ago, which was also talking about this body called a JITA, the Gaza International Transitional Authority, which is basically what Witkoff is referring to in this concept. What's notable is that there has been, in this form, the idea that the International Advisory Body will actually be established by the US. That has not been something that I had seen before. But still, there has been some reporting in recent days, I think in Haaretz and in Financial Times, that actually Blair himself will be the head of this advisory board. My understanding is actually that hasn't been finalized yet, but that is one of the ideas that's coming out there. But it can't be the PA, but we do want people possibly linked to the PA. I mean, they're calling it independent technocrats, but using the PA structure, possibly, at least the skeletons of it that exist in Gaza, and creating a government that can at least manage day-to-day affairs until the PA is ready to take over.
Right, and this is obviously perhaps we'll return to this a bit later in the program, but this is going to be a big one for Israel to swallow, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I think earlier, I think on Saturday evening, Bezalel Smotrich made this a red line in terms of what he's willing to accept with the U.S. plan, the concept of having any PA role, which is also something the government has said itself that they don't want any PA role in Gaza, and Netanyahu talks about it in his speech at the UN that we've heard about reforms before and it's never really played out. This time, there does seem to be certain steps that we've reported about regarding the prisoner payment reform. Some of it still needs to be audited to make sure that it's actually in place, but they have taken steps that I think for a long time people have been asking them to do.
Okay, let's move on. Number 10, an economic plan will be created to rebuild Gaza through the convening of experts with experience in constructing modern Middle East cities and through the consideration of existing plans aimed at attracting investments and creating jobs. 11, an economic zone will be established with reduced tariffs and access rates to be negotiated by participating countries. 12, no one will be forced to leave Gaza, but those who choose to leave will be allowed to return. Moreover, Gazans will be encouraged to remain in the Strip and offered an opportunity to build a better future there. Hamas will have no role in Gaza's governance whatsoever. There will be a commitment to destroy and stop building any offensive military infrastructure, including tunnels. Gaza's new leaders will commit to peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. 14, this is one I want to ask you about too. A security guarantee will be provided by regional partners to ensure that Hamas and other Gaza factions comply with their obligations and that Gaza ceases to pose a threat to Israel or its own people. So, what kind of security guarantee could be made?
I think that's going to be one of the parts of the negotiations that will have to be held. The language on this is very vague in terms of exactly who the security guarantee will be for. Is it for Israel? It seems like it's for the Arab states who will be participating. I guess making sure that Hamas does not resume its operations. I think there's been talk in the past of having them return or give over their heavy weaponry and possibly light weaponry to a warehouse that's guarded by either PA police or other Arab forces. But I think those details are not in this 21-point plan. But I think it's noteworthy that they made a point of including this concept of a security guarantee.
Right. So number 15 is kind of what you were just talking about, that the US will work with Arab and other international partners to develop a temporary international stabilization force that will immediately deploy in Gaza to oversee security in the Strip. The force will develop and train a Palestinian police force, which will serve as a long term internal security body. Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza, and the IDF will gradually hand over territory it currently occupies as the aforementioned replacement security forces establish control and stability in the Strip. If Hamas delays or rejects this proposal, the above points will proceed in tariff free areas, which the IDF will gradually hand over to the International Stabilization Force. Okay, this is really interesting to me as well, Jacob. And of course, as you noted in your piece, it's the first mention of the possibility that the deal could be partially implemented. But if you think about it, I mean, Israel has claimed that it currently controls, what, 80% of the Gaza Strip, if I'm not mistaken. So really, it could be implemented pretty quickly if all sides agree in, or at least Israel agrees, in 80% of the Strip. I mean, that's super interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think you could frame this. I mean, it's going to be a hard sell to get Israel to get on board if Hamas isn't there as well. But you could frame this as what Israel's been lacking in its military effort is the ability to fill the vacuums that it's temporarily created by clearing areas of Hamas forces. That Hamas forces have simply been able to go back into a lot of those areas. And that Manny's talked about this over and over again, how soldiers are fighting themselves back in Khan Yunis 3 or 4 or 5 times throughout this war. So if you instead have a stabilization force there, a new governing body that's starting to operate, obviously it will have to contend with possibly remnants of Hamas there, and that's going to be something that I think is actually going to be possibly a deal breaker in terms of getting actual Arab countries on board. I know that there's talk of them being willing to send troops, but I have a little bit of a hard time seeing them actually going toe to toe with Hamas on the battlefield. That's, I think, one of the reasons why Arab countries have been intent on having actually Qatar being part of the force, because I think there's a recognition that Hamas fighters will be a little bit more hesitant to fire on Qatari troops, if that's even a possibility that we see them in Gaza or even other Muslim countries that Hamas might have slightly better ties with. But yes, I think this is a very notable point to have in this plan.
Okay, number 18 is also notable because it says Israel agrees not to carry out future strikes in Qatar. That was definitely a big no-no, apparently. Okay, number 19, a process will be established to de-radicalize the population, and this will include an interfaith dialogue aimed at changing mindsets and narratives in Israel and Gaza. I found that very noteworthy as well, that it's mentioning both countries, change the mindsets in both countries.
And the de-radicalization of the population doesn't specify that it's just Gaza. And I think that's just a way of not upsetting the Palestinians and their supporters by just trying to be vague. But also, I think what's noteworthy is it talks about Israel and Gaza. And this is an extension of what the Trump administration views as kind of the Gaza conflict, as opposed to the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They very rarely tie the West Bank to Gaza, even though a lot of these concerning developments and trends that are happening in Gaza, obviously in a much grander scale, but they are happening also in the West Bank. And I think that this just how the Trump administration has approached this. They prefer to compartmentalize. At the same time, they are in this plan at least engaging a little bit with the PA. There is an involvement that will be mentioned in point 20.
Right. So point 20 is when Gaza's redevelopment has been advanced and the PA reform program has been implemented, the conditions may be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian statehood, which is recognized as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. This is a huge point, really. And, you know, for Israel to swallow this one, whoa, it'll take a liter of water at least to swallow that down.
I would agree.
Right. Okay. So, number 21, the U.S. will establish a dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful coexistence. And this is obviously the Palestinians in general, not just the Gazans. So, that is also of note. Jacob, it's just amazing to me that you brought this to us and that we were able to publish it. I guess you can't lift the curtain too much to tell us how you got your hands on this plan.
Yeah, I guess if I did, I don't think I'd be able to get too many future plans.
All right. I'm not going to nudge you too much for that. And we have been going on for a long time, but it is extremely interesting. And I appreciate all of your insight here today, Jacob.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Always a pleasure. And Shavua Tov, a good week to you, Jacob.
Shavua Tov.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.